Music as a Plastic Art, Strategies for Emergent Behavior in Instrumental Composition. So the first part of this presentation will explore ecological psychology's dynamic principles as a basis for a formal approach in treating instrumental composition as plastic art, as a way to have them bounded by primacy of the ear at every stage from composition to performer through performance. The second part discusses how these principles have guided several compositions and are now being applied to present and future works. Music as a plastic art. At the start of this research, Schiffer was aware of the similarities between painting and studio composition, wondering if plastique sonore and musique plastique, or plastic sound and plastic music, might be equally appropriate terms as musique concrète. Claude Lévi-Strauss makes the comparison again, saying, musique concrète puts itself into a situation that is comparable from a formal point of view as painting of whatever kind. It is an immediate communication with the given phenomena of nature. Now, for a composer, concrete practice offers a way to create and experience music without mediation via a performer's interpretation of a visual score. The work as performed by the artist in the studio is presented directly to the audience, much the same as painters and sculptors perform and present their works. Instrumental composers can also work with sound in concrete ways, but this direct approach in Western tradition usually stops before it gets to the performer. Even jazz solos, while traditionally learned from recordings, are more often a mixed media approach and get written down note for note as guidance and preparation for future improvisation. Working with studio and computer-aided tools, instrumentally oriented composers switch modalities, most commonly using standard musical notation or developing text-based or graphical-based instructions designed exclusively for that one work and its possible array of extended techniques. This project wants to avoid or at least control for that multimodal approach. So developing an internally consistent, creative oral practice is the goal of this project. Music as a plastic art and sound as a plastic material are applicable to all the works in this project, and the notion that it is in immediate communion with the given phenomena of nature opens it to discussion as a product of the dynamic, reciprocally resonant environmental system described in Gibson's phenomenological psychology. Grains of observation. Ecological psychology describes the relevant scale of observation for perception as the combination of the organism and the environment. The two, although often separated in studies, are functionally resonating subsystems of the ecological whole. And perception is actually an emergent trait that happens between the two of them, instead of something that happens as a result of the organism gathering information and figuring out what is going on. The environment and the organism are attuned to each other via their continuous coevolution and are endowed with traits that respond to each other's presence. And remember, the environment responds as well. This comes in later. Gibson refers to ambient energy arrays in the environment to which the organism is sensitive, saying that the organism and environment can respond to each other through these structures in a direct manner without having to abstract behavioral logics or conceptual constructs. This doesn't mean that internal constructs don't exist. An organism's behavioral predispositions have been physically shaped by its epigenetic history. Knowledge, or experience, is a physical attribute of the perceiving system. For us, specifically, a musician's training doesn't just include her personal time with the instrument, but includes an acquired history of training methods that predate her by generations. This coevolution of instrument, method, and personal training is why this research directs its focus to classical or at least standardized instruments in a bid to access the highly developed practices of musicianship already common in those performer populations. The biological substrate of knowing. Our neurons move towards each other like plants to the sun, and our brain changes shape as it absorbs new experience. That new experience may be as subtle as repeating an already familiar sound in a new context. The new context may be as subtle as a third or fourth hearing in the same chair in the same room 2 minutes apart. Cortical maps for somatic sensations are dynamic. The cortical maps of an adult are subject to constant modification, on the basis of use or activity of the periphery nervous pathways, sensory pathways. This neuroplasticity is the biological substrate of thought. It is that sensitivity and physical response to change that creates in an organism a mutually resonant relationship with the world. A sound will change the brain's shape, and the newly molded shape changes the way we perceive that sound. It is in this resonant space of neural growth in which a continuously recursive network of feedback loops nested within other loops and fed by more comprise a system that seeks equilibrium with the world to achieve its goals. Neurophenomenology. Information from any sensory modality has an effect at some level by all senses in all parts of the brain. These processing areas, despite their specializations for vision, haptics, kinesthetics, language, or any other, add more information to the oral result. One can hear the change between the apparent sound of D to a B by simply covering and uncovering the screen while watching a demonstration of the McGurk effect. The Stroop test is a powerful example of this as well. Perception is a combination of active searching, extent memory, epigenetic predisposition, and environmental circumstance. What we determine we have heard relies upon our experience and the combined perspectives of multiple senses. It is within this inexhaustible relata that sounds are chosen, rebuilt, and re-related to construct a musical work. Moving inward from the outside, the ear begins at the pinnae and extends past the tympanic membrane and ossicles into the cochlea. There, the mechanically amplified vibrations shake the inner hair cells, producing nerve impulses. These impulses proceed towards the auditory brainstem and olivary colliculus, through the medial geniculate nucleus, temporal lobe, and spread throughout the brain to join the neuronal bodies it shares with other senses. And it is mixed with all the traces of past experience distributed throughout the system. All along the way, fibers continuously feed back along that path, with each area's response to the original signal back to the cochlea. There, the organism uses the outer hair cells to modulate the reception of the new incoming sound as it seeks perceptual equilibrium, according to pre-existing sensory information, including other modalities, long-term extent memories, and the probable needs, what it's seeking out, in order to create a workable model of the world around it. The auditory web actively reaches outward via the senses and memory. Now, studio ecology. The composition studio is a purpose-built environment. It is designed for its special focus on sound and its manipulation. Commonly, microphones are used to gather sounds in the field and or from the studio and stored to disk. The composer's experience of the sound enters the studio via the body. He has, in effect, recorded his experience and has been physically changed by it, and participates in a system already weighted towards his experience with the sound. Inside the studio, digital and analog transformations are constantly reevaluated by the composer, and a continuous replay and feedback allows further oral consideration. Just as different regions of the brain have specific methods for acoustic signal analysis, inner ear, basal ganglia, auditory thalamus, etc., further auditory analyses are made available by studio manipulations, granulations, cut bell edits, splicing, speed, frequency, spectral manipulation, and the effective hardware. Historically, concrete music employed a closed-loop technique that favored alternate listening states. Closing a record groove so that it skips, or making a tape loop and repeating the sound, can cause a temporary loss of semantic meaning and related semantic connections. The sound is still audible, however, and the vacuum created by the absent semantic association can make it easier for the listener to explore other aspects of the incoming signal. In our case, this would be the spectral and temporal traits of the target sound, this hopefully leading to instrumental listening and being less affected by semantic interference, deciding which tools can be applied best to explore its potential materiality and musical use. Balancing and weighing in upon the satiation effect is that of semantic priming. In experimental psychology and in neural network research, it's more often referred to as spreading activation. By priming the subject with a word or set of words, related terms and classes become more salient to the participant. Spreading activation and saturation are both temporary and graded effects. This is, in this research, a way of instantiating a process of complex, nonlinear dynamics using the semantic connections, attractions, and sounds with semantic and spectromorphological similarities, various levels of source bonding, and active seeking behavior to elicit new sonic possibilities at both the micro and macro levels. The studio, as an electroacoustic augmentation of the composer's auditory system and its practice use, enhances the perceptual sensitivities of the composer, extending the sonic analysis through its analog and digital systems. This reciprocal resonance is a structural aspect of the following works at the psychoacoustic level, the psychological level, and the working method. It is a recursive, creative cycle of mercurially shifting audio data, and the whirls and eddies that rise to the surface can be claimed and understood as objects in and of themselves, and take us further, piquing our curiosity in a bid to reevaluate and further explore that sound, continuing on to elicit the emergence of new structures, acoustic, perceptual, and conceptual, in which the composer can realize the music while continuously being guided by the sound. Conclusions brought to the fore by reviewing the compositions are used to facilitate subsequent works, which are in turn evaluated and used to inform further work. It is another creative cycle of a larger orbit that contains the two previously discussed, whereas the monitor-computer-composer interaction is generally an analysis-resynthesis cycle occurring between seconds and maybe days, or maybe months and years. The written analysis composition feedback occurs over a period of weeks and maybe years. And finally, and I use that word loosely, another wider, even slower cycle, the one from social interactions through others-related research, is a component of what Keller has called behavioral ecology and extends beyond the given project, both backward and forward in time. Okay, cool. So, part 2, the instrumental consequences of plastic music. So what happens when this rule of plastic sound, of primacy of the ear, etc., is applied to instrumental music? So the visible score. Studio music is a proprioceptive act. It's akin to sculpture or painting. We've discussed this. Writing for instruments is primarily a written art. It depends upon highly co-evolved and culturally dependent graphic and symbolic communication. With instrument and fixed sound works, composers write and draw music imagined while fashioning concrete sound by hand and by ear. The two processes are sufficiently disparate that it could be described as a kind of mixed media production. For an instrumentalist, once assumed to be trained in the same methods of practice as the composer, the methodologies of studio composition can be an alien realm. Standard musical notation is no longer reliable common ground. Instrumentalists' training that was once a core aspect of musicality is often being marginalized in favor of innovative instrument design and scores idiomatic to a particular work and or a composer. Auditory ecologies for instrumental music. Ecological psychology's model of resonating subsystems is used in these compositions as a special case of the organism-environment system in which, by awareness of the system's dynamics and the system's parts, the system structure itself can be purposefully manipulated, not just reacting within it, but also by using the conceptual model of that system as an organizational tool. It is no coincidence that the terminologies that are familiar to systems dynamics appear here. The compositional method is aligned with notions of complex systems and emergent qualities in the same way as Gibson's observations of ecological equilibrium. The compositional array. The studio, the sound and their sources, as well as the player and the instrument, are the environmental components in these pieces. Gibson's notions about the systems being tuned to each other apply here, and the composer and the performer, as cooperating artists, respond to these structures in a direct manner. Structure, particularly musical structure, is picked up by the artists and shaped with other perceived structures. Visual symbols of any kind used to write for instrument and tape requires a switching back and forth between imagining sounds and translating them to graphic, lexical, or notation, as opposed to experiencing the sound as material and fashioning them proprioceptively. In the context of this research, it is a procedural as well as an aesthetic dilemma, using instructions on paper with written and graphic symbols to control actions and convey oral concepts to an imaginary performer about imaginary sounds is outside the scope of this project. Here, electroacoustic tools are used to fashion tangible audible materials to be experienced as such by the performer, and the environment is now sensorially unified, at least to a degree, placing the performer and the composer under the same aural paradigm. The unmediated instrumental composition. By dismissing visuals, we draw the performer into direct, phenomenal interaction with the compositional environment. For myself, it was also a way to invite instrumental performers into the acousmatic situation. Additionally, since, as Levi Strauss proclaims, it is comparable from a formal point of view as painting of whatever kind, and in immediate communication with the given phenomena of nature, considerations of creative ecology are brought to bear. We embrace the dynamics of studio composition for instrumental performance as one tier of an organizational cycle that gives rise to another aural environment. The performer interacts with the composition in a way that highlights the aural nature of studio-based music and takes full advantage of an enormous conduit of information that has remained untapped by conventional music writing. Auditory integration of the performer-composer ecology brings instrumental composition in line with primacy of the ear. The Western classical model that depends on specific performance instructions is maintained, but leaps outward, taking full advantage of modern analog, auditory, and digital processes in a dynamic systems model through which virtually limitless sonic information can be preferred. Additionally, having reduced the interpretive degrees of freedom to near zero, aural models can ideally create an impossible task, paradoxically producing a bounded yet infinite spectrum of musical outcomes. Okay, so the compositions. The study set, Parables, was conceived as preparation towards analogies of control for cello. They were intended to be a minor step towards a larger goal, but turned out to be more important than first thought. The contextual switch to plastic arts in an instrumental situation makes these pieces the first of a kind, if not in practice, but at least in intent. The performer imitates the sounds heard as accurately as possible. Using aural models, conceives and realizes these works entirely within the aural domain. As much as possible, the creative cycles that inform the compositional environment are entirely still sonic. Still, the model retains one aspect of the traditional score. It remains a set of instructions for interpretation by a performer, whereas the written score is supported by many decades of formal instruction and cultural evolution as to what these symbols mean. The aural model relies on aural acuity, technical virtuosity, and the performer's intersection, or the performer's personal relationship with his instrument's sonic capabilities. The mixed works, the studio compositions, analogies, and K, were realized first as completed fixed sound works. It was only after they were done that the sound sources were separated according to their source objects. Sounds derived from the intended instruments, the cello or the trumpet, were designated for concert hall diffusion, and sounds derived from various heat-stressed metals were assigned to the performer's model. This channeling becomes radically obvious in parables, in which only the cellist's rendition of the original signal is heard. These studies seem to be a first example of this method, and Mooney declares them to be a special case in electroacoustic composition. The sound sources for all three works models are recordings of different shapes and types of metal being stressed by frozen carbon dioxide. The oral model is delivered via headphones to the performer, who is instructed to mimic those sounds. The listener hears only the cellist's rendition of the models, not the radiating metals themselves. In analogies of control, in K, the heat-stressed metals were mixed with electroacoustic derivations and physical deconstruction of the target instruments. Again, only after the completion of the acousmatic version of the piece were the source objects separated and placed on three channels, a two-channel pair for diffusion to the audience and a monophonic channel only for the performer. Only the player hears the electroacoustic model. Chaos, complexity, and emergence. The performance version explores the physical intersections of the model, the instrument, and the player. The performer is embedded and embedded in his environment, and the renditions are the musical results of seeking equilibrium in that space. The sound sources and sound samples encourage reciprocal plasticity between the sounds and the concepts they represent. Sounds that are musically useful can be created from combinations and permutations of each work's samples, or chosen from stochastic processes, or even from accidents. Often, extant sounds are discovered to fit the changing context of the developing work. The work's larger form is developed within the context of the existing sounds, and since the sounds that will be used are often yet to be known, the structures of the piece cannot be predefined. These works depend upon emergent qualities and dynamics and a continuous reevaluation of the extant material to accommodate any new interesting content or context that the system might illuminate. Therefore, intent is continuously dependent upon the results of the ongoing analysis of the material, both sonic and conceptual. Compositional constraints are considered to be the materials in the compositional environment and the structure of the environment itself. What differentiates the context and content will vary depending upon the scale observed and the point of view, whether semantic, morphological, or even kinesthetic, and each piece's materials are intended to have an effect on that point of view. These emergent percepts could all be realized as fully auditory, but will always be affected at some level, covertly or overtly, by non-auditory information. As an example of an alternative ways to manipulate a part of the compositional environment and define its form, consider the way in which the sources were chosen and gathered in order to experiment with the available resonant systems. Whereas the sources in one work, Cross Country Runner, were chosen for their decades-long associations of running sounds and related actions. The sources for Gravities began with a novice training as a climber. It was with the express intent to discover and gather sounds yet unheard and associated with actions yet unknown, so that my experience with those sounds originated and were strengthened by the extensive physical and psychological changes in myself to which they are associated in pursuit of the composition. Another example, and much clearer actually, in a large-scale project by several researchers and artists in Brazil, the Palafito study, a highly controlled environment was presented to several invited artists, in which the modalities, mediums, tools, channels of communication, and subject matter were all used as environmental variables that were carefully bounded to develop site-sensitive intermediate artworks. So, observation, reviews, and reconsiderations of the first studies. Parables, the solo studies, and analogies of control, the cello piece, and K, the trumpet piece. First of all, there's a delay of around a half a second between the performer hearing the model and the reaction. As the player continues to learn the part, that time delay does decrease. Eventually, the work could be well known enough to anticipate as easily as any memorized written word, and the time delay reduced to nothing. Regardless of the level of memorization, though, the performer is encouraged to continue performing with the model. The more familiar the player is with the material, the easier it is to anticipate the next move, the easier it will be to hear more subtle details in the sounds, and in theory, come closer to some sort of absolute mimesis. One additional aspect of the piece is a re-emphasis of familiarity with the source of the sounds as an organizing principle. As in Taut and Cross Country Runner, the performer's neuromuscular constructs and relationships are expected to act as top-down organizing principles in the same way as a narrative or any other analogical methodology might do. Confounds and responses. In the first one of the performances of Analogies of Control, one of the cellists produced an evocative score based on his oral understanding of the part. The original and arguably primary purpose of eliciting a purely auditory response from the performer was usurped on the very first try. Now Thomas Gardner, his graphic maps were much like a typical diffusion score. They were quick sketches of gestures in the accompanying part mixed with those of his part. He wanted them for atemporal access to the piece. Part of the reason was the aforementioned time delay between the model and response, even though the piece was built to accommodate the lag. In retrospect, this could be a positive change. The oral primacy of the process becomes less overt than it was before. But, as Ricardo Clement argued in a personal discussion in 2007, that one of the composer's responsibilities to the player is to help facilitate the best performance possible. Now, while I believe that the different versions that I've heard myself have been successful, vibrant renditions, Clement's suggestion has validity. Availing oneself to the full advantage of players' training is possibly required. It is one of the primary reasons for staying with classically related instruments, and if expanding the channels of communication can be reasoned as within the boundaries of this form, they'll be used. Now, this does not necessarily mean reverting to standard musical notation or graphical scores, but it does raise the issue of synchrony, atemporal access to the part, and a well-trained player in using those resources. Keeping the performer tightly aligned with the listening situation is still a defining aspect of this music. So using primarily visual channels should stay fully in the service of the auditory. A visual model built through an agent with an intimate physical knowledge of the target instrument's acoustic signature seems internally consistent with the process. Gardner's descriptive score is his phenomenological reading of what he hears. Further, his interpretation of his performance is more relevant than if I had made one. Gardner's reading includes a long, personal, oral, and kinesthetic relationship with his cello, and his hearing will be markedly colored by that history. From an information processing and biological view, this will just add more neural real estate devoted to their auditory understanding of the pieces. Just as the eyes help retune the ears in a crowded room, or fingers can inform the eyes on a finely textured sculpture, the other senses can be, and often are, about hearing. Alternately, cellist Craig Hultgren has largely kept the process fully oral, most often foregoing visual materials. As I have heard several performances and rehearsals and recordings of Hultgren's versions, I will maintain that visual aids are not necessarily required to maintain sufficient relative synchrony. Infinite variation versus 0 degrees of freedom. Now, this compositional process produces works with two distinct faces. There is an acousmatic fixed sound piece that can be performed on its own, like any other acousmatic piece that's diffused to an audience in a dark room. And after the parts have been separated and the model is prepared, it becomes a new work with new potentials. The oral models offer infinite degrees of accuracy. Each performer's rendition reflects this, and each has been markedly different while still adhering to temporal and gestural aspects of the studio versions. The model's deep spectral complexity would be impossible to render accurately on paper, or actually to fully mimic, but the honest attempt to do so energizes the performance by digging deeply into the performer's oral kinesthetic and, most importantly, musical relationship to the ecology of the instrument and the composition. The diffused parts are being made as before from samples of the target solo instrument. The player is still the only one to hear the oral model. The sounds the audience hear will be from the performer's instruments and those derived in the studio from that instrument. So what the audience hears in concert is all cello-derived sound, or in the trumpet version's case, all trumpet-derived sound. The next stage is part of a larger musical project using paper. The new model sources were partly chosen for their sonic opposition to the former, whereas the heat-radiating metals were frequency-rich, chaotic, self-energized sounds. The new set, from paper and paper-like sources, are largely white and pink noise types and have hardly any autonomy. Any relation to chaotic systems is minimal, at most, and every sound is driven by hand. Two short pieces, one from butcher paper and the other from birch bark, have established the preliminary of the sound world. One short model, Class, has been used for cello and guitar. Both players, Davy Williams guitar, Craig Hultgren cello, have done imitations as well as non-imitative responses. The instrumental renditions seem nearly incapable of staying in that staticky white noise state for very long that the paper elicits. And the instruments have been a great way to add pitch to the process. I haven't figured out entirely how that frequency will be integrated into the diffusion parts, if they will be. This is an ongoing project. The other sources in the instrumental works will probably be water and other paper type sources. Butcher paper, newsprint, felted paper, and birch bark all figure in so far. Water sounds have remained separate from the process so far, but will likely be used to add more spectral content to the paper, as well as using the word and process of papier-mâché as a semantic link. The new work continues with traditional acoustic and electric instruments such as guitar, electric guitar, trumpet, cello, bass clarinet. Although this method can easily be applied to new instruments and performance interfaces, this research stays primarily interested in a level of instrumentality that surpasses affordances and delves deeper into effectivities. This level of integration is more easily found in populations that take advantage of that coevolution of instrument and technique that's developed over several generations. Musicians tend to be interested in and good at is using devices in a manner which operates at the edges of or outside the brief. And this research is so fully outside the design brief, it should and needs to make full use of years of proprioceptive fine-tuning and musicality that's required of highly trained performers. The performance instructions are the same as in the first work. Auditory signal to the headphone. Mimic these sounds as much as possible. Try to consider the players in this situation as processors, in that a signal arrives, it's analyzed, and changed as it is resynthesized on the player's instrument. The characteristics of that change is determined by the performer's oral acuity, instrumental expertise, and how that maps onto the actual performance. Future practice. I'm interested in how these performances will change over time, and should the performers keep these in their repertoire. In theory, the player should be on an ever-developing quest towards perfect mimesis. The original parables have been given to various target instruments with unique auditory profiles. If Judith Mitchell is correct, a cello instructor in London, and perfect mimicry is possible, the difference between a trumpet rendition and a string rendition could conceivably be insignificant. Now that would be an ideal target, however unlikely, as well as a step forward in instrumental performance. Even if the potential for truly dynamic differences is diminished. Using oral models in studio practice is a practical and easily adopted method that achieves rich, complex, as well as tightly prescriptive outcomes, while simultaneously affording a broad expanse of somewhat indeterminable results. If just a few examples of others' use of it is any indication, Stanovich, Clement, Morgan, and Bzika, it provides at least a practical addition to the methods of instrumental composition with fixed sounds. Fade to black.